By the end of 1944, one British weapon was killing more U-boats per attack than every other anti-submarine weapon in the Allied arsenal combined. It had no explosive warhead until it touched a hull. It didn't fire backwards. It fired forwards. It threw a circle of 24 contact bombs into the sea ahead of the bow. If they missed, they sank in silence. If they hit, the U-boat below was already gone. This is the story of the Hedgehog, the forgotten Royal Navy mortar that by the cold arithmetic of post-war audits was the deadliest submarine killer of the Second World War. And the reason almost nobody remembers it is the same reason it worked. To understand why the Hedgehog mattered, you have to understand why the depth charge failed. Because for most of the war, the depth charge was all the Royal Navy had. It was the weapon every escort ship carried. It was the weapon every newsreel showed. It was the weapon that, by the audited statistics of the war it supposedly won, almost never worked. Here is the arithmetic. Across the entire Second World War, the Royal Navy made 5,174 depth charge attacks against German U-boats. Those attacks killed 85.5 U-boats. The half kill is real. It belongs to a submarine that was shared between two escort ships on a joint attack, and the credit was split between them. 85.5 kills out of 5,174 attacks works out to a ratio of 1 kill for every 60.5 attacks. Put differently, the Royal Navy could mount a depth charge attack on a U-boat with full ASDIC contact and a competent crew, and on the average run, less than 1 in 80 of those attacks would actually sink the boat below. That number, less than 1 in 80, is the entire problem. The reason for it is geometry. ASDIC, what the Americans called sonar, sent a directional sound beam through the water. It pinged off a U-boat's hull and gave the escort a bearing, a range, and a rough depth estimate. So far, so good. A destroyer could find a U-boat in the open Atlantic from over a mile out. But the depth charge was a stern weapon. The barrels rolled off the back of the ship. They were thrown out sideways from K-guns mounted on the rails. To attack, the destroyer had to pass directly over the target. And here, the math began to bend. ASDIC was a cone pointed forward and down from the hull of the attacking ship. As the destroyer closed in, the cone tracked the U-boat downward and underneath, but there was a dead zone directly below the hull where the beam could not reach. Inside that final cone of darkness, the U-boat disappeared. For the last 60 seconds of the attack run, sometimes longer if the boat was running deep, the destroyer was firing blind. The captain dropped his charges by guess and dead reckoning, based on where the U-boat had been the last time he had seen it on the screen. A competent U-boat skipper knew exactly when this blind window opened. He could hear the destroyer's propellers shift gear as it accelerated for the run. He had drilled the geometry until it was muscle memory. The moment ASDIC contact was lost, and he could often hear the pings break off, he ordered a hard turn, sometimes 30 degrees, sometimes 90. He hit full power, blew air through the ballast tanks, dove for the thermal layer if there was one. By the time the depth charges reached his last known depth, the U-boat was no longer where they were going to explode. The water around him roared. His pressure hull shook. His light bulbs popped. He survived. And here is the worst part of the depth charge's design. Even when he did not escape, even when the destroyer guessed right, the explosion itself blinded the attacking ship. Depth charges set off enormous hydrostatic shockwaves. Those shockwaves bounced through the water for minutes, swamping the ASDIC return, filling the operator's headphones with what sounded like white noise. If the first pattern missed, the destroyer had no way to find the U-boat for the follow-up. By the time the water cleared, the boat was miles away under a thermal layer. So 1 in 80 is not a statistic about bad luck. 1 in 80 is a statistic about a weapon designed to attack a target it could not see at the moment it fired, and which deafened its own sensors every time it tried. Now multiply that out across the Battle of the Atlantic. In 1942 alone, Germany had over 200 operational U-boats at sea. Each one needed to be found, tracked, and killed. To sink one U-boat by depth charge required on average around 60 separate attack patterns, with each pattern consuming 10 to 14 barrels of explosive, each barrel weighing several hundred pounds. That is hundreds of tons of high explosive per kill. That is fuel burned by destroyers running at flank speed. That is hull life consumed by escorts pounding through North Atlantic gales. That is escorts pulled away from the convoys they were supposed to be protecting, while the convoys continued to bleed merchant ships at the rate of one every few hours. In the first 3 years of the war, U-boats sank 2,780 Allied merchant ships. The math was not just inefficient, it was losing the war. The solution arrived from an unexpected direction. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker was a British Army officer who had spent the interwar years tinkering with infantry weapons. He had invented a recoilless contraption he called the spigot mortar, a design in which the propellant lived inside the bomb itself, and the launcher was nothing more than a rod that fitted up into the tail. In 1941, his concept was picked up by the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, the Royal Navy's pet research outfit, known internally as the Wheezers and Dodgers. The Directorate had been hunting for a way to throw explosives forwards rather than backwards. An earlier device, the Fairley mortar, had failed sea trials aboard HMS Whitehall, but the principle held: get the explosive out in front of the ship, drop it on the U-boat while the U-boat is still on the screen. The Hedgehog was the answer. It looked exactly like its name. A steel frame mounted on the forward deck, bristling with 24 upward-pointing steel spigots, each capped with a sleek bomb the shape of a stretched mortar round. From a distance, the array looked like the spines on the back of an animal hunched against the spray. Sailors started calling it the Hedgehog before it even had an official designation. The name stuck. When fired, the launcher discharged all 24 bombs in sequence over the space of about 2 seconds. The spigots were angled so the bombs spread outward in flight, landing in a roughly circular pattern about 130 feet across, around 200 yards ahead of the ship's bow. Each bomb weighed 65 pounds. Each carried 35 pounds of Torpex, a high explosive about 50% more powerful than TNT by weight. Once they hit the water, they sank fast, about 23 feet per second. A U-boat at 200 feet depth had less than 9 seconds from splash to impact. That is the spigot solution. Forward fired, circular pattern. 24 chances at once, dropped into the water ahead of a ship that still had its target on the screen. But the forward-fired pattern was only half the trick. The other half, the half that actually broke the geometry of the depth charge problem, was the fuse. A depth charge has a hydrostatic fuse. It goes off at a preset depth whether it hits anything or not. That is the whole point of a depth charge. You cannot aim a thing you cannot see. So you set a depth and hope. The Hedgehog bomb, by contrast, had a contact fuse. It only detonated if it struck something hard. A submarine hull, a keel, a conning tower. Anything else, sand, mud, open water, and the bomb sank to the bottom of the ocean and lay there inert. Read that paragraph again. Because the consequences of it are the entire reason the Hedgehog became the most efficient submarine killer of the war. When a Hedgehog salvo missed, nothing happened. There was no explosion, there were no shock waves, there was no roar of disturbed water around the attacking ship. The ASDIC operator never lost the U-boat. The submarine below, deaf to anything but the splash of falling bombs and the receding propellers above, sometimes did not even realize it had been attacked. The destroyer turned, reacquired the target it had never actually lost, and fired again and again, until something below cracked open. When a Hedgehog salvo hit, the U-boat was dead. The contact bombs went off directly against the pressure hull, every one of them within a tight circle. Torpex against steel at point-blank range. A single hit, and remember, 24 bombs were in the water at once, was usually enough to breach the hull beyond repair. 2 or 3 was a catastrophic kill. There are very few accounts of Hedgehog hits from the German side because almost nobody who was below the waterline survived to write one. And here is where the math becomes interesting. Because by the audit, the Hedgehog rewrote the entire arithmetic of anti-submarine warfare. The early figures were not impressive. The first prototype was bolted to HMS Westcott in 1941. There were no kills with the weapon for over a year. The first confirmed Hedgehog sinking did not come until November of 1942, by which time the system had been installed on roughly 100 escort ships. Initial success rates sat at around 5%, only marginally better than depth charges. Crews did not trust the weapon. Some captains refused to use it. The Royal Navy in early 1943 had to issue a written directive ordering its captains to explain, in writing, why they had failed to deploy their Hedgehog on a submarine contact. The fix was training. An officer was sent from the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development to the escort base at Londonderry, the heart of the North Atlantic anti-submarine effort. He ran briefings. He walked the captains through successful attacks. He explained the geometry, the circle on the water, the contact-fuze, the fact that you did not lose contact when you missed. The kill rate climbed almost immediately. By the end of the war, the audited figures looked like this. Total Hedgehog attacks across the war, 268. Total kills credited to Hedgehog by the Royal Navy, 47. That is a ratio of 1 kill for every 5.7 attacks. Compare it directly to the depth charge ratio. The depth charge was 1 in 60.5. The Hedgehog was 1 in 5.7. Attack for attack, the Hedgehog was over 10 times more efficient at sinking U-boats than the weapon that did most of the killing on screen. In the final stretch of the war, the ratio became even better. By 1944, Royal Navy figures showed roughly 1 in every 5 Hedgehog attacks, resulting in a confirmed kill, 20%, against a depth charge baseline of about 1.25%. And it was not only the British numbers. The United States Navy, which adopted the Hedgehog through reverse Lend-Lease in late 1942, became its most aggressive operator. 11 of the last 16 U-boat sinkings achieved by American destroyers and destroyer escorts in the Second World War were Hedgehog kills. In the Pacific, the destroyer escort USS England used the weapon to sink 6 Japanese submarines in 11 days in May of 1944. 12 salvos, 6 kills, a 50% hit rate. No other anti-submarine weapon in the war ever matched those numbers. The Lock-class frigates, which mounted twin Hedgehog installations, were credited by some post-war sources with a 60% kill rate per salvo by the end of the war, 6 out of 10. The depth charge crews working the stern of the same vessel were lucky to see 1 kill in 100 attacks. So why does almost nobody know the name? The answer is, more or less, the same reason the weapon worked. The Hedgehog was silent. It made no drama. It produced no film. A depth charge attack was cinema. The running shape of a destroyer turning at speed, the barrels tumbling off the racks, the white geysers walking across the surface of the sea. You could photograph it. You could put it in a propaganda reel. The Royal Navy could show it to King George, and the United States Navy could show it to Roosevelt, and everybody nodded and felt that the war was being prosecuted with vigor. A Hedgehog attack looked like nothing, a short series of dull thuds as the bombs left the spigots, a scatter of small splashes in a circle ahead of the bow. Then, silence. Sometimes, most times, that silence simply continued, and the ship turned to fire another salvo. Once in 5, instead of silence, there was a single thump from deep below the surface, often a second, half a second later, sometimes a third. No fountains, no drama, no camera knew what it had just seen. Then oil, then debris, then the body count. The films of the Battle of the Atlantic, the documentaries, the newsreels, the post-war memoirs were built around depth charges because depth charges were what you could see. The Hedgehog's distinguishing feature, the silence on a miss, was also its visual erasure. It killed in the manner of things that do not film well. There is also the matter of pride. The Royal Navy, when its post-war history was written, found it easier to talk about the depth charge, the weapon every sailor in the Atlantic had handled, the weapon that was on every ship from the first day of the war to the last, than to credit a peculiar bristling spider on the forecastle that most captains had initially refused to use. The Hedgehog also belonged uncomfortably to an army officer. The spigot principal was Stuart Blackers, an artilleryman, and the directorate that championed it was a research outfit the regular fleet had treated with suspicion until the kill statistics came in. It was easier, in the official histories, to fold the Hedgehog into a paragraph and move on. So the figures, laid out in one place, look like this. Over 100 Royal Navy and Allied escort ships were fitted with Hedgehog launchers during the Second World War. Destroyers, corvettes, frigates, and destroyer escorts of the Lock and River, and captain classes, plus eventually most of the American destroyer escorts that crossed the Atlantic. The weapon was credited with the destruction of 47 U-boats by the Royal Navy alone, with a further substantial figure credited to American and Canadian operators in the Atlantic and to American crews against Japanese submarines in the Pacific. The kill-per-attack ratio, audited at war's end, was roughly 1 in 5.7 for the Hedgehog, against 1 in 60.5 for the depth charge, a weapon more than 10 times more efficient at killing submarines than the weapon every reel and every film showed doing the work. And the figure that almost nobody knows, the one buried at the back of the audit, is this. By the war's end, the depth charge needed 60 separate attacks per kill, with each attack consuming 10 to 14 barrels of high explosive, several hundred individual depth charges in the water per U-boat destroyed. The average Hedgehog kill used 24 bombs. Total. 1 salvo from the bow, less than 15 seconds of fire, 1 U-boat, 1 crew, deep below the convoy lanes of the North Atlantic, never coming back up. And the Royal Navy crew above it, still in ASDIC contact, still hearing the pings come back, still alive, turning the wheel for the next contact, the next attack, and the next merchant ship that was now going to make it home.